Well, Steve, we're talking about the national debt, and I think it's always good to actually put some numbers in the picture so we can talk about them. What are the actual numbers on the national debt, and what is this distinction between the gross national debt and the publicly held debt?
Sure. So in aggregate numbers, the total federal debt is in the $18 trillion range, just slightly over $18 trillion. Now, it's a big number. It's also very difficult to comprehend and conceptualize out of context. And so the context that a lot of economists and analysts use is to say, how does this compare to the overall U.S. economy, and say the gross national product, or more specifically, gross domestic product, as they say, GDP, which is something the listeners might have heard of. In that case, we're at about 17.5 trillion thereabouts. So in terms of debt load as a percentage of the overall U.S. economy, it's about 103% of the U.S. economy. Now, what that means is we've got more debt than we have assets, in a sense, to pay it off. Now, this is just a matter of context. It doesn't mean that all the debt's going to come due on a specific day simultaneously, and therefore we've basically corrupted and bankrupted our country. That's not going to happen, as fearful as that sounds. Doesn't mean debt's good or necessarily inherently bad, but we'll talk more about later what the real downsides to having these level of debts are. But for the most part, what that $18 trillion is composed of is outstanding treasury bills, treasury notes, treasury bonds, things of this sort. Money, or I should say, claims to taxpayer money, kind of on into the future. What that's, or I should say how that's been created is whenever a government, the federal government runs a deficit, meaning they spend more than they take in, they have to pay for the bills somehow, and they can't do it with tax revenue, or at least they haven't because they haven't collected as much. And so what they have to do is they issue bonds. And those bonds build up over time, and the deficits build up over time, and that's how we've gotten ourselves into the pickle that we have now in $18 trillion debt load.
Now, what about in the past? Have we ever really had a debt to GDP ratio that was over 100% before? And what were the things that brought on that kind of debt load?
Sure. The only time we've seen this debt load that was larger than 103% was in the 110 to 118% that we saw during World War II. Huh. No surprise, because we were fighting a world war. And so we had a lot of outlays to pay for guns and munitions and for soldiers. And so, and tanks and planes and submarines. And so we had a lot of money going out the door. Now, what's interesting is that number dropped precipitously after World War II. It went down to the 60% or even just 70% range and below very quickly during the demobilization period after 1947 or 1948, thereabouts. So what you really saw was the debt being driven by a worldwide military crisis. And that's not something we've seen since. And so it's probably a much better comparison to say the debt load in peacetime has never been as high as it is today, because that's a much more relevant comparison.
Well, isn't it also the case that in the 1950s we didn't have the unfunded entitlement claims that we have now, and there was room to grow and pay down the debt?
Oh, that's exactly right. Yes, that's precisely. And the claims on government, or I should say taxpayer resources, were much less prior to the 1960s. That's certainly true.
So, I mean, realistically, based on what you know, your background, what are the chances of us being able to just grow our way out of this debt without taking some sort of extraordinary measure like a constitutional amendment?
It would really require a great deal. In fact, I don't think it's even mathematically possible, but even if there's a hope of getting out from under a portion of it, it's going to radically, I shouldn't say radically, but it's going to require a great deal of changes in spending patterns at the federal level. It's going to require, at the very least, some kind of leveling off, if not a diminution and a cut in overall government spending. But as of right now, there's not any political will to do the sorts of things that are going to be required. If you have any hope of getting a handle on this problem, you've got to follow what we call a fiscal Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm. And yet Congress has gotten very good at continually doing harm every year and every fiscal year. And so having some kind of institutional barrier to doing this is going to be critical. This actually harkens back to some of the work.
Yeah, one of the things that we've done at Compact for America's Balanced Budget Amendment is define a balance in terms of a spending limit, and just say that you can only spend tax-derived cash or proceeds from full faith and credit borrowing, but you can't spend anything else. What do you think of that? How does that?
Well, that makes actually that's basically the corollary of what we've seen could work at the state level. I mean, that's effectively answering the problem that we've discovered at the state level, which is kind of a redefinition of debt. This is in some respects, a broad definition, but it's also very specific and explicit. And I think that's going to be the key factor here in all of this, especially since you've got to kind of create an incentive for them to stay within the boundaries. And so having, first of all, a definition that's going to make sense to them and also is very hard to evade is going to be a critical factor in all of this. And a lot of the discontent, I think, in a lot of conservative or right-of-center circles was actually a concern that I shared, which was if you have a balanced budget and you say all you got to do is balance the revenue with the spending, you can see the weak part here is going to be the spending lobby is going to get the better have more of the lobbying clout, I guess you can say, and you end up increasing revenues, and as a result, you're going to hurt your economy because you're going to end up, in a sense, favoring tax increases over spending cuts in that kind of scenario. And so one of the interesting things I think that your limit does, and I think it's important, is you, in a sense, create this kind of supermajority, in a sense, for tax increases. And you've also got to put into play this trade-off. Right now, any budget that's passed at the federal level, because there's no balanced budget requirement, there's no need to trade off. All you got to do is just simply kick the can down the road and send the bill to a future generation. But now having a limit, both a spending and a debt limit, it's going to require a very clear trade-off. It doesn't mean you can't do new things with government, as much as I might not like to have that kind of environment, but it requires a trade-off. And it requires spending cuts somewhere, or savings, not even cuts, but even if you just say privatize certain aspects or offloaded certain things from the federal responsibility, making a private responsibility. That will free up room in the budget, and it kind of creates a necessity for more creativity in the federal government. Now, granted, sometimes federal creativity is a bad thing, but I think in the context of having a limit of this sort, it creates a trade-off that and puts the burden of proof on the spending lobby. It puts a burden of proof on the people who want to expand government spending. As of right now, the burden of proof is on people who want to maintain or restrain spending. And so this kind of momentum is actually a much welcome change from what we see as business in Congress currently.
Well, the danger of debt is not just that it can't be serviced, right? It's also that government is making claims on resources that non-governmental people could be making claims on. And
right.
When that happens, do we enhance our economic growth or do we diminish it from what it would otherwise be?
Right. So right now in economics, there's a general presumption of what they call crowding out. So effectively crowding out of the private sector. And what that means is if you've got federal debt floating around out there, investors will use that debt as part of their portfolio. And that's not surprising. U.S. debt is still pretty stable, certainly by comparison to most European countries, for instance. And so there are going to be a lot of people holding that in our portfolio. But there's a limited amount of fungible, investable capital in any economy. And so if you have a lot of it being swallowed up by government spending, in this case as evidenced or as funded in a case by debt, you're going to have this money like a sponge sucking money out of the private sector just because of that trade-off. You've got to have the money come from somewhere. And so it crowds out private investment. Now, over time, while it may not look like a lot in the short term, over time, you'll actually see a decrease in potential economic growth because of the fact that you've sucked this private capital out of the private sector. And in fact, what you notice is that the money that's being spent by government tends to be far less effective at generating economic growth than any private dollar. It's not a one-to-one trade-off. And sometimes some of the rates of return studies I've seen actually have less than $1 of economic value for every $1 in government spending. And if you look at some of the debt studies that have come out about debt percentages, and more specifically debt loads for nations, and developed nations in particular like the U.S., the threshold of where you begin to see a diminution in this economic growth as a result of crowding out is probably in the 90% range. Now, these are generally worldwide studies, which include a lot of these small economies we've talked about before, like a Greece, for instance, but it includes big countries and developed countries like the U.S. So we're already well above that 90% rate. So I think you can safely say that our debt load is probably inhibiting our long-term potential for economic growth in the United States. And so I would say that having a debt cap, and more specifically a balanced budget that actually gets spending under control at the federal level, could actually have a pretty good impact on potential economic growth going forward.
I'm going to hit you with some quick questions. Just want to know the quick policy effects. All other things being equal, if you limit federal borrowing and make it less than it would otherwise be, what happens to jobs?
Well, in all these cases, I think you're going to see upward movement. I mean, you'd have to expect there to be a kick to job growth in that sense, because you're liberating a lot of capital that was either sitting on the sidelines or were being swallowed up by federal bond purchases. So in that case, it's all going to go somewhere. And we don't know where the job growth is going to occur, but I think in the aggregate, you would have to expect there to be some positive upward tick in that, yes.
Okay, all other things being equal, if we saw a shift in the federal tax code to something that had fewer loopholes, fewer exemptions, deductions and credits and so on, would that be positive or negative for economic growth?
It'll be very positive. In fact, I think there's probably a general consensus among economists across the board that the way the tax code is structured now is it actually, in a sense, puts government in the position of steering capital in one direction or another. That's really clearly not the best way of doing it, because government's terrible at playing venture capitalists in the broader sense. So yes, again, taking down these barriers that in a sense either are barriers or sort of edicts and commandments from on high to say, well, you invest here, you get a tax benefit, but not over here. Removing those barriers when in conjunction with a broader policy change would absolutely have a very beneficial effect on job growth and just general economic growth overall.
Okay, last question. All things being equal, if federal agencies knew that there was not a limitless credit card that they could count on being drawn whatever they spend, would they tend to have more efficiency or less efficiency in their operations?
I think they would have more efficiency. I mean, government bureaucrats are human too. You know, they respond to incentives. Some people might say they're less than human. I'm not going to go that far. I think they respond to incentives, right? And so if you give them the right incentives, they will do, on average, the thing that's going to make most sense to them. In this case, it's going to be, well, either we perish as an agency or we just find better ways of doing things. We're not going to buy the $14,000 toilet seat or the $200 wrench. You know, we're going to go ahead and make sure that we find better ways of doing things. We're going to contract out for some services. We're going to find more efficiencies on how we do things. Maybe they go to paperless publications of things. You know, all these sorts of small tweaks around the edges, these marginal changes, are going to have a big impact over the long term. But they're not going to get there unless they have an encouragement and incentive to do so. And so the world that you've envisioned with where this compact limit is in place is exactly the kind of incentive that's going to precipitate that kind of change. And that's the kind of incentive we don't have right now.
So do you think that leaving the political system to its ordinary ways without a constitutional amendment, we can get there?
I don't think so. I think the founders in their infinite wisdom did create a constitution of checks and balances, and I do think gridlock for the most part is a good thing at the government level, because that actually keeps things from getting worse. Government as a percent of GDP, for instance, goes down during periods of gridlock. But a lot of these are cyclical. A lot of these movements in one way or the other will kind of, the pendulum will swing back in the other direction, and we start to see massive debt overhangs and increases in spending. And so the cyclical nature is unavoidable, I think, in American politics. And this is actually, as I said, in a sense, a bug and also a feature of the Constitution. But I do think in order to actually, in a sense, make sure that we have a kind of a persistent trajectory for making sure that these rules stay intact, you can't expect statute law to actually do it. In fact, the Graham-Rudman limit from the 1980s was statute law. And once you hit the recession of the early 1990s, Congress just threw it out the window. So we've already seen our experiments with statutory debt limits and more specifically spending and tax limits not work very well. So you have to have something that's going to be stronger with teeth, that's going to be long lasting. And so constitutional provisions are really the only things that can really get you there over a long time frame.